Get the home field advantage every time with Fairfield by Marriott, official hotel partner of the NCAA. Whether you're a student athlete working toward your championship dreams or your team's biggest fan, Fairfield by Marriott has everything you need to get ready for game day. From comfortable guest rooms to complimentary hot breakfast, Fairfield is part of the Marriott Bonvoy portfolio of hotels and official hotel partner of the NCAA. Visit fairfield.marriott.com to book your next game day stay.
Welcome into The Verge, a show which covers the Baltimore Orioles minor leagues. The Verge is part of BSL Radio. Baltimore Sports and Life is dedicated to analysis and discussion on the Orioles, Baltimore Ravens, and the University of Maryland. The site has a team of writers providing coverage of those teams and houses live streaming content weekly. Join the conversations at the message board, like BSL on Facebook, and follow BSL on Twitter.
Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since we discovered Spotify for Podcasters, we feel like having options like video podcasts and Q&A lets us be more creative on another level. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Welcome to On the Verge. This is Zach Spedden, joined by Nick Stevens and Chris Stoner, the owner of Baltimore Sports and Life, who is joining us this week to fill in for Bob Phelan. Bob, as you know, is on the 10-day IL. We're optimistic that he will be rejoining us on schedule, but we'll have more updates between now and next week. On tonight's episode, we're going to recap the 2021 Orioles season, such as it was, and talk a little bit more about the young players that stood out to us and the jobs that they did this year. We're also going to recap the season that the Norfolk Tides had, get into the players that we think could be part of this club in the immediate future, what stood out to us, what was good and bad. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But first, On the Verge is brought to you courtesy of Mercer Floor and Home Carpet One. Mercer is a third-generation family business that was established in 1959 and is located on Main Street in beautiful, historic downtown Westminster, Maryland. For all of your flooring needs, think Mercer. Beginning of each show, each week, we like to shout out our new patrons who have joined our Patreon community. And Nick, who do we have new this week?
Yeah, we had two new people join, so welcome. And apologies for name pronunciations here again. So Marinelis Iscara, I believe, has joined, and David Sorrell. I'm assuming I pronounced that right. I'm sorry if I butchered those names. Welcome, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you for your support. And our guest host tonight is the owner of Baltimore Sports and Life. He is also a co-host of The Warehouse, where he talks Orioles with Matt Corey and Stephen Loftus. He's also the host of Sports Tonight, which is part of BSL Radio. He is Chris Stoner. Chris, thank you for joining us tonight.
Glad to join, and sorry, listeners, replacing Bob. I'm not going to do as good a job there, but glad to be on. Zach, Nick, and Bob have done a great job all year, and pleasure to join tonight.
Well, we're glad to have you on. So we'll start off with the Baltimore Orioles, who finished the season in line to have the number one pick in the 2021 draft or 2022 draft, unless anything changes with the collective bargaining agreement. If you're a regular listener to On the Verge, we kind of stopped talking about the major league team regularly somewhere like around Memorial Day, maybe a little sooner. But it is what it is. And so I'll start with Chris here. I know that this season was a struggle in a lot of ways, but what were some of the highlights and the lowlights for you?
The highlight was Cedric Mullins, that he established himself. I mean, the year he had was unreal. I mean, we went into the year not expecting him. I did not expect him to last all year as the center fielder. And then I got thinking, well, if he could be a 750 OPS guy with a plus glove, that has plenty of value. Maybe he's a multi-win player, but he sustained it all year, and he wound up having a year that was where he's going to deservedly get MVP votes, not just the most valuable Oriole votes. So that was the highlight of the year that he established himself there. I am a huge Austin Hayes fan. He had the 2 IL stints, struggled over a portion of the year, but finished strong. There's still questions about whether he's a long-term piece or not, but I remain optimistic there. He at least will go into 22 as a de facto starter on one of the corners. And then obviously Ryan Mountcastle. April was a struggle, and then end of the year, this last month, the last few weeks, a little bit of a struggle overall. But for the year, you got to be really enthusiastic about what he provided there. And he's going to be a low-cost option at first or DH for some time, and that has plenty of value.
Yeah, I think all those were good, and I think we're going to kind of expand on a lot of those guys a little bit more here as we talk about the Major League wrap-up. But just overall, I didn't watch a whole lot of the Major League product, to be completely honest. I think the John Means no-hitter was like the last game that I watched from first pitch to last pitch. So that was right before the minor league season started. But yeah, seeing Ryan Mountcastle succeed, that was a guy we talked a lot about last year when we started this show without minor league baseball. Mountcastle was a big focus. It was cool to see him settle in and finish the year really strong too at the end of the year there, and then show improvements all year. John Means proved that. I think all Orioles fans kind of knew this going into the year, but in my opinion, he proved that he's a quality major league starter for years to come. Middle or back into this rotation. We'll see how things shake out. But John Means had another pretty solid year. And like Chris said, Cedric Mullins, I remember very vividly that Cedric Mullins, that was back in Bowie in 2019. And I never imagined, I thought he was done. I thought the career was over there, to be totally honest. And to see him now be in the conversation for AL MVP is just phenomenal. So a lot of bright spots, even though this was a terrible year overall at the major league level, there are some bright spots, and hopefully the future is a little bit brighter in Birdland.
I feel like there's a bit of a foundation coming together with Mullins and Mountcastle. You could throw Means in there as well, because I do think that the Orioles are going to hold on to him for a while. I guess going into the offseason, the big question marks as far as trade options go were Anthony Santander and Trey Mancini, whether or not the Orioles hold on to those guys for next year, and in the case of Mancini, perhaps pursue an extension, or they trade them. And another name, and this is something we discussed last week on here, is DJ Stewart, who struggled again this year. There are seemingly now options behind him to take over that reserve outfield role. The name that I would most be intrigued by at this point is Robert Newstrom. But I'll throw this out there. Just start off with Santander and Mancini. What do you think the offseason holds for them with the Orioles?
For me, I'm fully expecting Mancini to get an extension. I think he would have been traded at the deadline had they were really looking to trade him. His value isn't going to be more than it was at the deadline. And I think there were multiple options available to move him at that point. If they move him here in the offseason, it's not the end of the world to me. I mean, Mancini, obviously it's a great story. He's a good player, not a great player, but I think they can find a deal that works for both sides, and I think he can be a piece of the roster going forward. Santander, look, I mean, his strengths and his weaknesses are pretty clear. He's got real power. Last year, he was a Gold Glove finalist, whatever that means. Basically, he's an adequate corner outfielder, and he's got real on-base issues. But if you're trading him now, you're doing so with his value at a low. Myself, I would just prefer the arbitration isn't going to be that much based off the revenue the Orioles have available to them. I like to have him come back for the first few months next year. He's either improved or he isn't. If he's not, then you can move on to AAA options. We'll discuss later in the show.
Yeah, I agree with Santander. I think you're looking at 5 years now of data on the guy, and he's barely a league average player. I mean, it's a fun story, and he's had some moments. And we've kind of seen what kind of player he is, and I don't think it's not an everyday starter. I think he's could be a really good fourth outfielder on a major league roster. Maybe you give him more strategic at bats and favorable matchups. You give him a less opportunity to get hurt out there, not playing every single day. He does have good power from the left side. We know that's going to play well at Camden Yards and Fenway and Yankee Stadium. I mean, there's a role for him, I think, at the major league level, but I mean, I think he is who he is, a 250 hitter with pop who will struggle to crack 300 on base percentage. And that's kind of it. You're not going to get anything for him. With Trey Mancini, this conversation, everybody's had this conversation. The articles have been out there. They're going to keep going. I don't think the Orioles have to make a decision this offseason, right? He still has another year on his contract. So, they could probably wait to make a decision on this, but I hope just some decision is made this offseason, whether it's a trade or an extension. To me, when I think about this, though, the Orioles aren't in a position where they just have to dump guys for minor league depth anymore. Like, they can hold off for that top dollar value. But with Mancini, if you think about a trade return, like what kind of haul do you think he's really going to get? Like, is it a Jahmai Jones caliber hitting prospect or like a Garrett Stallings level pitching prospect as like the headliner? And if that's the case, then Trey Mancini is going to provide a lot more value to the Orioles, keeping him, extending him, than bringing in with some of those guys. We don't need more Garrett Stallings type pitching prospects. We don't need more Jahmai Jones type, caliber prospects. We have plenty of those, plenty of depth in the minor leagues. So I think you keep Trey Mancini, even taking the emotional side of this, the emotional aspect of this out of the equation. I think you extend Trey Mancini this offseason.
It would be frustrating for me with the idea of trading him, not so much the idea of him being traded, but the idea of we didn't trade him at this non-waiver deadline, and now we're going to trade him this winter or potentially next waiver deadline, where the value can't be more. The one thing I will say, if you did move Mancini and back to Santander, even if he is only just a league average-ish player, potentially he has value, as Nick said, as maybe he's kind of the fourth-ish outfielder. He can rotate on the corners, and then he's also a DH option there. But really, I think the writing's pretty much on the wall for him, but I would just assume bring him back 200 bats. That basically takes you through the end of May. He's either producing at a higher level or he's not. They talked a lot about his ankle injury that he dealt with most of this year. And if he's not producing at a higher level, then you have internal options you can move on with.
Yeah. If you want to compare Santander now to Kyle Stowers, which is really hard to do because Stowers obviously has no major league time, whereas Santander has been up for a few years. Stowers, to me, no question, has better natural power than Santander does. And I think when he's on, probably plays an outfield that's maybe slightly worse, a tick worse than Santander at his best, but still he's not going to hurt you out there, especially to short right field. However, because we know that Stowers does have something of a strikeout tendency, I think that there is a reason to hold him back at AAA next year that has nothing to do with service time. So maybe the idea is you bring Santander back. That gives Stowers the opportunity to continue to develop at Norfolk. If Santander, through Memorial Day, through the end of June, going into the All-Star break, is healthy and can at least be a complementary piece to a contender, that's when you look to flip him. Because that's probably, you're probably not going to hold out a lot more to get good value for him. And then you have that internal option that you can go to step into right field.
I like that. And I just keep thinking about DJ Stewart in this as well. Like, dump him for whatever and bring up Robert Newstrom if we're talking outfield options. Robert Newstrom could definitely give you more production than DJ Stewart can. I would bet money on that. But yeah, I do like that Kyle Stowers. Start him in AAA again next year and let Santander go and let's see what he's got. I mean, I'm fine with giving him a few more months. We'll see. I would hope that I can't really speak on like potential free agents. I haven't looked at the list. I know Chris just wrote a piece and put a lot of potential options down there on BaltimoreSportsAndLife.com. But I would hope a lot of that money that the Orioles do hopefully spend this offseason goes towards the pitching and maybe some help. We've talked about defensive help on the infield. So outfield, there's a situation there where you can let Santander come back and play for a few more months at least.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Nick, since you mentioned, I do want to have Chris give the listeners a little bit of insight into the piece that he had over at Baltimore Sports and Life over the weekend, kind of recapping this season a little bit, but then also getting into how he thinks the Orioles could approach this offseason.
I just started the article, and I prefaced the article, and I'll preface this. I'm a huge Mike Elias fan. I think he's the best thing that's happened to the Orioles in multiple decades. But I also feel we've now reached, I think yesterday was the last day of the Mike Elias era where, for me, wins and losses don't matter. At this point, it's time to improve as a franchise. And the reason I say that is really three things have been accomplished three main things have been accomplished in the Elias era. You have pared the payroll down, which gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of either absorbing existing contracts or doing something else. You have a core of players. We've talked about some of them that I think are existing on the roster, and then certainly the next wave of guys that are directly on the come. So it's not about believing that you're going to do anything this winter that's going to take you towards contention. We understand where the Orioles are starting from at this point, but I think the 23 Orioles can potentially contend. And I think to get to that, most of that's going to come from what you do internally, but I think it's time to augment what that existing core. Nick said in the previous question there, hopefully if we see any investment into the roster, it's with a couple of arms. I did list a number of different scenarios that are available. We've talked about it on the warehouse multiple times on that pod. There's a lot of guys available, and we're not just talking about the top end of the market that are available that can directly significantly improve this roster. And I'm not talking if you wanted to talk about the larger acquisitions, you can make a case, but I'm talking about guys on shorter term deals that should be readily available to the Orioles to improve the current major league product. And I think it's time.
Yeah, I think there's some short-term targets that the Orioles could look at. And I think for me, what it comes back to is how do you want to manage the next 2 or 3 years where you're waiting for a top prospect to emerge? And one of the players that Stephen Loftus mentioned on the warehouse, and Chris, you mentioned in your article, is a guy like Brian Anderson. Brian Anderson, to me, is an adequate stopgap to get you to a Gunnar Henderson if you think he's a couple of years away still, to a Jordan Westburg, or, even if we're looking further down the line, Kobe Mayo. Just whatever that option is at third base, Brian Anderson's a good option to be that stopgap. Obviously, the shoulder concerns are present, but, hopefully when working on the trade, you see something in the medicals. So I think that's kind of where the Orioles should look this offseason is how do you make that bridge to some of their younger players a little bit better? Because this revolving door that we saw at third base next year is not going to help a young pitching staff develop at all. Same goes for second base, really. And, you also have to see improvement from your young pitchers. You got to see Ballman, hopefully Lothar and Wells, Kyle Braddis, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, when they get that opportunity next year to really take advantage of it.
Yeah, I was going to throw a name out there because there's one team out there that is completely falling apart. They may or may not have fired their manager already, and everything seems to be just a complete chaos out there on the West Coast in San Diego. So, we're trading Kyle Stowers and Kobe Mayo for Manny Machado, right? That's like the big winner acquisition.
Welcome
just throwing
home,
that out
right?
there. Yeah. No, but
I go back to the arms. What I really go back to is where do the Orioles want to take their payroll? And I don't have an answer to that. My guess is probably not much higher than where they are. You guys recently had on John Mioli, and he had done an estimate for, he went for the arbitration projected raises, and he projected the opening day payroll next year at $54 million. Well, $54 million, if you look back at what the Orioles were spending in 16 and 17, and you project, inflation-wise, basically the Orioles are spending roughly about $183 million. So I'm not saying go from 54 to 183 million, but whatever the payroll is, whether it's 54 million, 75 million, 140 million, there are multiple options available to you. And you've had accumulating depth in your system, as you guys certainly have pointed out through all your work on the Verge and with your prospect list and your different articles. Otherwise, there's a lot of increasing depth. There are multiple ways to go. Identify some pieces that you can tangibly go out and add and augment the existing roster with, and it's shows some improvement. But going back to the other arms, it's the arms that are already here, and we're going to talk about more of them. But I keep calling them kind of like the group of 10. There's like those 10 guys that are basically not Rodriguez and Hall. They're basically everybody else that's right on the Verge or periphery. That it's you might only think Bauman has kind of mid-rotation upside, but there's a lot of guys that could projectably help a roster in some form or fashion. A number of them got major league time this year. It didn't go so great overall, but the Orioles have to get some level of production out of that group, on their roster. Curious on your thoughts, and we can get into that on some of those arms and where they are going forward.
Yeah, I think so. For me, like when I'm looking at the rotation, I mean, you lock John Means up. I think you give him a deal, you extend him. He's around for the next couple of years, right? There's no doubt in my mind, like I said before, that he's a major league starter. You're bringing
I think he's under control through 24, right? Yeah,
at least.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you've got him around, right? That's one piece, and I know. I think the biggest disappointment this year was the fact that Dean Kramer looks terrible down in AAA. He had a few spotty good starts at the end of the year with Norfolk, but it was rough for him. It was rough for Keegan Aiken. It was rough for Zach Lowther. I know there's injuries. We've talked about before that we felt like the handling of Zach Lowther and maybe Alex Wells a little bit, Isaac Mattson, arms like that, probably could have been done better. But that's a whole separate discussion. But I think, fingers crossed, you look at Grayson Rodriguez and John Means, that's two pieces. And then I'm looking at like Michael Bauman, Kyle Bradish, Keegan Aiken, Zach Lowther, Dean Kramer, Alex Wells. Can you get one out of that group as a viable starter? That's 3/5 of a major league rotation. And then you still have guys like DL Hall in the system, Drew Rom, Carter Baumler, who I know a lot of experts like outside of the organization are very high on Carter Baumler. I know he's recovering from Tommy John. He's many years away, but I'll throw in Gene Pinto as well. Bob's listening and watching live. I know we can't go on talking about pitching prospects without mentioning Gene Pinto, so that one's for Bob. But I do think Gene Pinto obviously has a ton of potential. Can you find one more out of that group? Maybe, hopefully. But even then, you you go after your stud free agent pitcher in the next year or so, and you have so much hitting talent, so much depth you've acquired in the minor league system. You can trade for another established veteran. There's your 5-man rotation. But it's just there's 10 guys right there. Can you get just one viable starter at least? And if we can't, we have bigger issues, and we're a whole separate podcast now. But I mean, you've got it. You're going to get one out of that group at least.
Once the Orioles have gained the additional year of control, if the CBA is not addressed, if there's not a change in the service time rules over the winter, once the Orioles have gained the additional year of control and Rauchman and Rodriguez are up, let's say the start of June, really end of May, somewhere in there. At that point, you've got your starting catcher, and basically you've got everywhere outside of short and third. At that point, you have a viable lineup, right? And Rodriguez, as you said, he teams with Means. My thought is, for next year, you look at Rauchman. Can you be a league average catcher? Rodriguez, can you be a league average 4th or 5th starter? I would hope that's realistic for them as they get their, get their feet wet. But the other guys, that entire group, we started the show talking about Cedric, right? And Nick, you mentioned in 19, and you talk about Cedric going from the major league roster and dropping all the way down the buoy and looking completely lost. So I'm not writing these guys off completely because they came up and this year they struggled, and understanding certainly what they went through in 20 as well, and that's certainly not helping their development issues. But I'm also not completely comfortable with the idea of going into 22 and saying, here are multiple spots waiting for you in the rotation. For me, it would be, let's go to spring training and see where we are. And if several of you have to go back and earn your way back up, Kremer, outside of Bauman, might be the guy in that group that I still have some excitement for, even though this year was a complete wash. You look at his Ks, look at the hits per inning, there's still something there. It's just, can he ever have the fastball command, to really play off of some of the secondary stuff? But it's a group there, like whether or not they ever establish themselves as major league starters, they've all done something, 6 of them, the ones that came up this year, they had all done something through the AA level as starters. Get something out of them, whether that's your bullpen or otherwise. I can't help but think about Tampa and how they develop their pitching and utilize their staffs, and feel like they would be getting more out of that group collectively.
Yeah. And just another point too, I'll throw in there is that people talking about like Michael Baumann and his experience he had at the major league level this year. And I saw some comments of people like, I'm not really that excited about Michael Baumann, or like he didn't really look that great. The gap between AAA and the major leagues, I've seen a lot of people who are way smarter than I will ever be when it comes to baseball. A lot of people have made that comment this year that gap between AAA and the major leagues is as big as it's ever been, and it's growing even wider. And so like Chris mentioned, what 2020 did to a lot of these guys, especially Baumann and Bradish and Lowther and stuff, they didn't get that opportunity to pitch regularly. And so you're going to have a full offseason. Ideally, a lot of this outside of baseball stuff is largely behind us. And hopefully these guys can have full, healthy offseasons. They're all going to be healthy this offseason, enter the offseason healthy at least. So you got a full, healthy offseason to go into spring training. And I think then we can really start to get better evaluations of a lot of these guys.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there were a lot of odd factors going on between AAA and the majors. You have a guy like Alexander Wells who had to spend all of the pandemic leading up to the spring in his native Australia. So, you have to figure that affected his development a little bit. So just examples like that, you had these taxi squad situations where pitchers would be brought up for, 3 or 4 days at a time and not in AAA getting reps, which I don't think helped. So there's a lot of things that I think when we get into 2022 and hopefully things are more normal, that we can start to see more of a natural progression between AAA and the majors.
Even the guys that went to the extended camp last year and they were facing the inter-squad competition, that's not the same developmentally. And, that was something that was missed. If you were excited about those arms in 20, you shouldn't be completely dismissing them now, whether or not you believe they're going to be projectable major league starters or not. There's still something there that you can get something out of them. The rest of the article we pointed out, a couple of number of names. Nick, just, if we stay on the major league portion for 1 second, I would just love to add 2 viable major league starters. I would just think that would just add a world of difference. 2 names that I'm most excited about right now are Alex Wood and Rodriguez of Boston. It looks like the Red Sox would like to move on from there. We're not talking about top of the upside arms. We're talking mid-rotation arms that should be viably obtainable for the Orioles. And if you just team those 2 with Means and maybe Rodriguez comes up end of May, June, and then all of a sudden it looks like you have the makings of a true major league staff. And that would go a long way towards actually having a more viable product.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, I was listening to a Braves podcast earlier. I have podcasts from like all teams in my rotation, boring 9-to-5 office life. So I like to see what other fans from other teams are talking about, get the vibes there. And this Braves podcast I was listening to was talking about the Orioles and their series and how this team, as bad as they are, like they score runs and there is a good core there. So people outside of Baltimore recognize this small core at the major league level. And I do like that. If you have, I think what Mike Elias, when he made that comment about Rutschman and Rodriguez possibly starting next year on the opening day roster, and Rodriguez, it not necessarily being a prereq that he has to pitch in AAA, I think he's not going to say that if he honestly didn't mean it. And so based on everything else with promotions and everything, so I could see a situation where Rodriguez does start the year on the opening day roster with John Means. We haven't even mentioned Bruce Zimmerman's name. I don't know how you guys feel about Bruce Zimmerman, but I feel like he can come back next year and deserves a rotation spot, give it an opportunity. You got 3 guys right there. You signed 2 viable guys that can go out every 5 days, not Matt Harvey's, every 5 days and pitch well. And I think you do have a good team. I mean, it's not a playoff team, but you have a much higher quality product at the major league level. And you have a ton of pitchers you can use out of this bullpen, Baumann, Bradish, Lowther. You can use all those guys out of the pen. You can use a 6-man rotation, whatever you got to do. But at the end of the day, it's a much better roster in 2022. And that's all we can hope for at this point.
Yeah, completely agree. And as for Zimmerman, I'll just say that, and I know this, takes this a grain of salt. The rotation in 2021 was better with Bruce Zimmerman in it than it was without Bruce Zimmerman. And I still wonder what he could have contributed without the injuries that he dealt with this year. I feel like if nothing else, he could have been that guy that most of the time kept you in games and kept it close enough for that offense to come back if there was an early deficit, which a lot of the Orioles starters this year couldn't do.
Zimmerman, I'll just say I'm not sold on him as a starter, but I'm sold on him as a guy that can help a roster, to be repetitive there. Of all of the arms that we saw this year working their way through, he was kind of early on, he was the most consistently competitive, to your point, of keeping the Orioles, in games, which is all you're really asking for out of that fifth. Ultimately, I'm not sure if he can stay in that role, but he could certainly be a guy that could help you 2 to 3 innings at a time and probably provide more innings than the typical reliever, and I think that would help a roster.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll move on now. We'll recap the Norfolk Tide season. Overall, when you count the regular season and the final stretch, the Tides go 52-78, which amounts to a .400 winning percentage. There were some downs this year. A few guys that we expected to have big years didn't quite produce at Norfolk. We also saw some players like Jemiah Jones slump along the way after getting off to a hot start. Yusniel Diaz struggled with injuries and was generally not consistent when he was healthy. Ryland Bannon was kind of in a similar boat, but there were some highlights. Adley Rutschman obviously going there late in the year, making an impact. Kyle Stowers looked really good there late in the year. So there was a few others in there. Kyle Braddis, after kind of hitting a rough patch over the summer, picked things up and had a great September. So, Nick, I'll just start with you. An up and down year for the Tides in a lot of respects, but some positives, I think.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about Norfolk Tide season, going and preparing for this episode, and it was a tough season from the jump when Jemiah Jones and Yusniel Diaz both went down with injuries very early in the year. But going into the season, this roster had like 8 top 30 prospects and a 9th in Michael Baumann that we thought would probably be there a lot earlier than when he eventually showed up due to the injury and the longer rehab process he took. But I really thought this was going to be a big year for the Norfolk Tides, but unfortunately, another tough season that saw today. Gary Kendall, their manager, and their pitching coach, Kenny Steencher, were both let go from Norfolk. So I'm not too surprised by either of those based on some of the, we'll say, progression or lack of progression with some players. But with this Norfolk roster, I don't know. Adley Rutschman was the definite bright spot. Kyle Stowers hit well in his limited time in AAA. The strikeouts were still high, but he continued to walk. And instead of he traded in a lot of that home run power. He led the organization with 27 home runs. He traded in a lot of that home run power for more singles and doubles. So I thought that was really good to see. I think Robert Newstrom put himself in a position to compete in spring training. Ryland Bannon had his peaks and valleys, but that oblique injury, that can hurt you for the full year, at least have an impact all season long. So I have no issues in giving Ryland Bannon another season in 2022 to see what he can do. But as far as the pitching stuff, Kyle Bradish was the stud, and I will talk more about him. But Ofelke Peralta was another thing that also impressed me in his time in AAA. I know we'll probably dive deeper into him on our Rule 5 episode, but he showed me that I think there's even more there to unlock when it comes to Peralta. And so at the major league level, I think he can be a real weapon in 2 inning stints, but we'll see. And I also we can't, so I throw his name out there before we bypass him and I forget about him, but shout out to the big man, literally the big man, Felix Bautista. He pitched at 3 levels this year, ended at AAA, a 2.45 ERA with the Tides, 5 saves, 33% strikeout rate. He dropped the walk rate. I know it was 12%, which I know is still really bad, but that was a significant drop from his high in AA walk rate. And he only walked 2 over his final 7 innings. So give the big man a big league opportunity, Mike Elias. We got to see that guy in the major leagues, but some positives, some negatives, but overall a decent season from some of the top prospects, at least.
I guess I was most encouraged. Well, and Nick said the players are mostly encouraged about. Obviously, it would start with Stowers, frankly, but I guess where I really wanted to start was what I was not encouraged about was the acquisitions from the Machado trade with Diaz and Kremer, aforementioned, and their struggles this year. That was a downer for me. I thought Diaz going into the year. I thought there were good reports for him out of the extended camp last year, and then some in spring training. I thought he had a chance to make the roster at some point this year. It was a disaster for him this year in all sense. And for me, he's now at the point where you just forget about him until he does something to make you back on your radar. There's a lot of discussion today on the board, BaltimoreSportsAndLife.com, about, would you keep him on the 40 or not? I think there's enough deadwood on the 40 you can knock off that I would still keep him there, but he's not an automatic keep at this point. And Kremer, we discussed. I still have some optimism. Maybe he winds up as a reliever himself, but certainly disappointing there. we talk about a couple guys individually, but obviously Stowers and Newstrom, that was encouraging. Those were good to see. I'll also give a mention for Sedlock, getting up, his kind of second half there. Bowie was good. AAA was okay, but it was a big year for him, just kind of staying healthy on a mound and showing some level of progression. If you turn him into a reliever at this point, I think maybe you actually have something. We mentioned all the names in front of him in terms of his starter. I don't think he has any really starting potential for this organization. I'd like to see them make him a full-time reliever starting next spring. The other name, you guys certainly mentioned that you've been on it all year. Bradish, really excited to see what they directly have there. What are your guys' thoughts on Kevin Smith? That was kind of wasn't real excited about the end results there.
Nick has a lot of thoughts here, so I'm just going to go ahead and let him start.
First of all, you talk about Diaz first, and then I'll go into Kevin Smith. But yeah, Yusniel Diaz had a 476 OPS this season with 4 home runs. Ryan Ripken had a 456 OPS and almost the same number of at-bats. And Ryan Ripken swings a baseball bat like I would, like if I stepped into a major league batter's box drunk. Like that's just it's if Ryan Ripken has better numbers than you, like you retire, you quit. Baseball is not in your future. And Diaz is real close to that. At least according to Rock Kabako, Diaz is going to the Arizona Fall League. Those rosters haven't been officially announced yet, but like that's a trip to salvage his career, I think, in Baltimore. And we've had Eric Longenhagen on, who didn't have a whole lot of positives to say about Diaz. Alex Fast had to dig deep to find something nice to say about Diaz. And John Mioli pretty much closed the door for me with his comments. No real excitement there. The fact that he's not a Mike Elias guy. Maybe there's something to be said for that when all three great baseball minds all have the same opinions about this guy.
Mike Elias has had some pretty. I know Elias isn't going to dog his players in the press, but Elias has had some pretty positive things to say in terms of his ability. There's been multiple evaluators over time, the third-party evaluators, who have looked at him and said, hey, there's a skill set there that works, but you got to produce. And when you have a sub-500 OPS season and a couple hundred at-bats, and this is coming off multiple injured years, there's not going to be a whole lot of excitement, and everyone's going to be particularly down on you. But for me, again, you look at some of the deadwood that's still on the 40-man roster, clear that off. If you have to remove Diaz, okay, but if you can find a room to have him back, have him come back, put him at AAA, and you either produce or you don't. And if he gets back on the radar, great. If he doesn't, he had the opportunity. I would wonder if there's something else particularly going on with him at that level of non-production, right? I mean, not health or just something else. But I mean, that's a completely lost year. Certainly, it was disappointing seeing him and Kremer every day, every fifth day with Kremer's results once he went back. And I guess there was a comment again back on the board today, and there was like, so would you, if Diaz had not been part of the Machado trade, would you just be automatically ready to keep him off the 40-man? For me, if he had the exact same skill set and was not part of the Machado trade, this is still a guy that had success at a young age at the AA level. That you had multiple people in the industry excited about at one point, still relatively young. What's he, 24, 5-ish, probably next year. So not overly young, but still young enough that if he went back and produced, I would give him that opportunity and not to go back too often to the Cedric Mullins well, and not everyone's going to follow that huge, that crazy example. But sometimes you get written off, and sometimes you rebound, and sometimes you don't. Probably at this point, you fully expect nothing out of Diaz. You expect him you never expect him to ascend. You expect him to flame out, but I would still give him the opportunity. But that's me.
Yeah, we could. I don't know, Zach, if you have thoughts about Diaz, and then I can dive into Kevin Smith after.
Yeah, I think pretty much you guys have touched on my thoughts with Diaz. I think that there's enough roster spots that you can clear this offseason that you can keep Diaz on there if you want to, but he has moved down the outfield depth chart for me in this system. There's now to the point where I have several players in front of him, and not just Kyle Stowers, but Robert Newstrom would be in front of him for me. I would put Zach Watson ahead of Yusniel Diaz right now, not in terms of who's going to reach the majors faster, but who just excites me more.
Also McKenna and Nick, you were on that more than I was. McKenna certainly took advantage of his AAA time this year, and he got some exposure in the bigs. There's multiple guys that are directly ahead of him. There's nobody that you're going to be. They can't be excited about what they have right now. He is some 500 OPS. Sorry, let's go back, Nick. What were your thoughts there on Smith?
Yeah, so Smith, I mean, I do hope Diaz can turn it around, but we'll see what he does in Arizona. But Kevin Smith, I will preface my Kevin Smith thoughts by just saying that this was the Miguel Castro for Kevin Smith plus a lottery ticket prospect. I can't remember off the top of my head who the other throw-in was there with that Kevin Smith deal. But I would make that trade 10 out of 10 times, trading a Miguel Castro type reliever for a Kevin Smith type prospect 10 out of 10 times, because you're going to hit eventually. And Kevin Smith, still young as well. I think he's only the same age as Diaz, around that same age. Still potential there. I'm not closing the door at all on Kevin Smith, but he had a 6.23 ERA and a 7.05 FIP in AAA this year, 2.24 home runs per game. And yeah, he had 10.8 strikeouts per game, but he also had 7.8 walks per game. 19% of hitters he faced in AAA, he walked. The whip jumped the last 3 months of the year from 1.62 to 205 to 2.21 in September. Just in September alone, he walked 20 hitters, only struck out 17, and more than 50% of all of the pitches that he threw failed to reach the strike zone. I mean, I have not seen lack of control like that since, like, the only name I could think of was, like, for the diehards out there, you remember, like, Matthias Dietz. I think he got cut last year. Like, that guy, I still remember, and actually it was Melanie Newman who was calling the Salem Red Sox at that time. And Dietz was warming up in the bullpen and like threw like 2 or 3 warm-up pitches onto the field in the same half inning. Her reaction was priceless and said it all. But that's the kind of control that like Kevin Smith was showing in September. It wasn't getting any better with those starts. And I know I can see why protecting Smith on the Rule 5, he's Rule 5 eligible. I can see why protecting him would be an easy decision. I know Zach's made a lot of those points in the Patreon WhatsApp group, but you have to imagine that that's going to be a very tough decision, I think, this offseason. That's a deep conversation that Elias and crew has, because it was, Simkin Tribute said in the comments there, it was night and day. AA, he looked unhittable, fantastic. And then AAA, it got worse and worse and worse from the moment he went up. And maybe that's part of the reason why, like, letting a guy like Kenny Steenstra, the pitching coach in Norfolk, go. Something that we've talked about a lot this season was how pitchers specifically getting the bump from, low A to high A to AA, et cetera, all those guys, the adjustment windows were very small and they pitched very well after their promotions. We saw progression, but once these guys reached AAA, we stopped seeing that progression from these pitching prospects. Kyle Bradish was a slight exception. So maybe a pitching coach change down there helps out. An offseason helps out. They got data on him now. We'll see what happens, but not a great year for Kevin Smith.
Nick, do you remember that horrible series in Memphis? I think it was in July, where it seemed like at the end of the first inning, every game, it was 10-0 Redbirds. Yep. Kevin Smith, that was his first really bad outing in AAA. And whereas I felt like the other pitchers who pitched in that series eventually kind of turned a corner, Smith, for whatever reason, never got back on track after that outing. Part of what I question is, did the stuff drop a little bit? Did he struggle as the year went on, just wear down? And that explains the velo and the walks. Part of it, too, is what I question is, Norfolk didn't play that many teams this year. So Smith has multiple starts against Durham, who was probably one of the best, if not the best, all-around team in minor league baseball this year. Multiple starts against Jacksonville, who seemed to always hit Norfolk's pitching around. And after a while, I have to think that those hitters just picked up on Smith and hit him hard. And I think that is something of the problem. Now, as for the Rule 5, this is sort of the opposite of the Diaz problem, because Smith is a Mike Elias guy. Does Mike Elias want to risk a little less than a year after making that trade of Smith getting picked up and for some flukish reason sticking in the bullpen next year and turning around? Or does he protect him and think whoever the pitching coach is at AAA next year has to figure out what went wrong and how to get him back on track? Because up until mid-July, Smith was one of the best pitchers in this farm system. That's not an exaggeration. It's just that he dropped off so much that we have to have this conversation.
Yeah.
Again, there's probably enough deadwood that you can directly remove from the 40-man. I see Bob actually had a post about that earlier today on the board. He mentions at least, I'm going through a list here, there's 15 guys that are easily removable that you should be able to find room to have Smith back.
Yeah. And that's why I think he is protected, because there is so much deadwood that you can chop off this roster and give him another year for sure. And that doesn't mean, he has to be in the major leagues at all next year. He could spend all year in AAA next year as well. But it's just concerning that we add him to like the Zach Lowther and the pile there at AAA who didn't really perform, and guys who we were kind of excited for. That's disappointing. But we all, at the same time, we've had so many success stories, especially when it comes to pitchers in the lower and mid levels of the minor leagues, that it's for us to only be having such limited conversations about guys falling off as hard as Diaz and Smith did. I think that's trying to look at this as positively as possible, but a rough year for Kevin Smith.
So I'm going to go back to a question that Vivek had earlier on YouTube. Can Norfolk ever get to Durham Bulls level? Now, Durham, as I mentioned a moment ago, probably the best all-around team in minor league baseball this year. Had a lot of great prospects, including Wander Franco, come through, and I believe finished with the best record in AAA East this year. I would say that if Norfolk is going to get to that level, it's probably next year, especially if the service time rules come back in some form and Rutzman and Rodriguez do start there. I'm curious to hear what you guys had to say about this.
The rotation can be stacked. I mean, if you figure one of the 6 guys that ascended to the majors this year that was back and forth in terms of if you factor him into the rotation, right, and then the progression of Rodriguez into AAA, if that happens, and even if a couple of those guys wind up in the Orioles bullpen, it's still 5, 6, 7 guys fighting for spots in the rotation that can be pretty strong. And you start with that. That's a good beginning.
Yeah, and I mean, this roster, other broadcasts pointed out when they would play Norfolk that there was a lot of talent on that roster. It just wasn't performing. They weren't performing up to the expectations. Tyler Nevin was kind of hit or miss. Yeah, he had power numbers, but he really struggled to hit for a high average. Rylan Bannon, Yusniel Diaz had their tough seasons. There's a lot of talent on this Norfolk roster. It just didn't seem to all click this year for guys. And then the pitching did seem to be the major issue with these guys. Like I mentioned, the prospects not really progressing. And then I think Connor Wade was one of like the top innings guys in Norfolk's rotation. So, I mean, yeah, guys, teams like Durham, I mean, we know Tampa Bay's situation. They're stacked. I don't know which minor league division, like Tampa's affiliates did not win the championship. I know Durham won the final stretch deal. This year, the best record over the final 10 games. I mean, that's just not even a Durham issue. That's just Tampa Bay as an organization. They're just monsters. They're freaks. They know how to do it right. They're my World Series pick, I think, this year as well, looking at the playoff bracket. But yeah, I'm hesitant to say like Norfolk's going to be better next year because I'm a legitimate fan of the Norfolk Tides. Like, as weird as that is for anybody to say they're a fan of a minor league team. I grew up right next to the ballpark. All my summers spent at Harbor Park. I love the Tides, and I really thought this was the year, but it was frustrating to see some of those big names not really produce this year.
One of the things you guys have mentioned during the year, and this was something I projected going into the year, I thought Elias was going to be more apt to push guys along this year, and that certainly happened within the system. And you saw guys move, as they performed. So, how quick do guys like Westberg? Do they go? Does he wind up starting back at Bowie, or does he get pushed up to AAA to begin the year? And you could argue either way, but how fast do they want to put those guys together? Push their best talent up. Elias was definitely more aggressive, moving guys, and I think that's going to continue as we get to this phase of the rebuild.
Yeah, I don't think after this year you can say Mike Elias slowly brings up his prospects. He was pretty aggressive with some guys. Jordan Westberg, first year pro ball, played in 3 levels, and now you are having this conversation of does he start next year in AAA, which I think he does. So a great, like Vivek's comment there, great year for promotions. I think that's entirely accurate.
Yeah, and going back to the Durham discussion, Simkin Tribute had a comment a minute ago, which is the Durham not stats more 4A guys than prospects there. Throughout the year, from what I could see from Durham, it seemed like a steady balance, especially when you compare it to a team like Charlotte, which basically had a major league bench in its starting lineup for a lot of the season early on. But yeah, I think that's a good point, because if you have the level of talent that Tampa Bay has at the major league level, you can stick 4A guys in Durham for most of the year. I mean, when Tampa Bay picked up Sean Armstrong, how many organizations would have just thrown Armstrong into the bullpen just because he's an arm? Tampa Bay, though, doesn't have to do that because Tampa Bay builds really good rosters year after year, and they've been doing it for a while now. So that does help your AAA team out, that you can, stash guys down there that on most teams would probably be in the majors.
Sean Armstrong might get a World Series ring this year, guys. Just sorry to bring that up. We can move on.
So Bob has weighed in here. He is watching. And, hold on. Wrong comment. See, Bob, I'm not as good at this as you are. We need you back here quickly. All right, here it is. This is Bob, and I'm late to this. But maybe he has to start switch hitting.
Reverse Cedric Mullins. Why not? Go out in Arizona and try it. Let's see.
Go out, stay healthy, do something. Yeah, right.
And now, as we always do in the final segment of On the Verge each week, I do have one more question up here that I want to get back to, just to go to Major League talk. Adi weighs in. Could there be a reunion with Eduardo Rodriguez or Zach Davies this offseason? We talked about Rodriguez a little bit, but I wanted to get this up here to get your guys' thoughts on Davies.
The peripherals were horrible with the Cubs this year, but he was also on a $3 million contract. So $3 million contract this year with worse peripherals says he should be obtainable for the Orioles. And he's been a viable major league starter in his career. And compared to anything the Orioles have trotted out there over the last 4 years, then there are spots available. I'm not opposed to it. Get me one guy I know I can definitively rely on next to Means and another major league starter, and I would be pretty happy. I'm still on the Rodriguez wagon, but there are a number of other guys, and Davies would be one of them.
Yeah. Looking at Davies' page now, I mean, he was good in Milwaukee, and he was good with San Diego, and he was with Chicago this year, and Chicago was kind of a dumpster fire as well. So, what impact did that have? They dumped Yu Darvish for, peanuts. So, if it's less than $3 million that you're going to be able to bring in a Zach Davies type for this year, I'm on board 100% with that move.
Yeah, I would be interested in bringing Davies back just because, I think as Nick mentioned, things with the Cubs this year were so unstable. He's shown before that he can pitch in parks that are tilted a little bit more towards hitters. So I'd be curious, especially sort of the buy lowest.
He made $8.63 million. I got confused there, but still, he's not going to make. He shouldn't make more than that this coming year, based off of what he experienced there with the Cubs. A couple other guys, Pineda, that's been kicked around there. One guy we talked about as a trade target was Minea. If that's obtainable, I'd love to see that. A lot of Ks there. And that's one of the things with the increasing organizational depth and, again, the payroll flexibility. Hey, you should have the ability to go out and make a move like that.
So we'll move in now to the final segment where we do talk about that depth a little bit. We focus on guys outside the top 30 that stood out to us this past season. This is probably going to be the last week we do this segment for a while. So Chris gets to join in here, and he's going to start off with his pick.
Well, again, you guys have just done such wonderful coverage with On the Verge, but also with articles at the site. And you had your top 50 prospects in July, and number 37 was outfielder Michel Deson, 19 years old. And the quote there from the Orioles International Scouting Director, Kirby Perez, is viewing Deson as a potential five-tool player. And, he had a pretty big year before moving up to Delmarva there at the end of the year. So I'll be interested to watch him as he goes to his first figures to have his first full season play next year and see how quickly he progresses at that level. If he's competitive at low A over at age 19, 20, maybe you really have something. So that'll be fun to watch.
Yep. I think I mentioned this when we talked about him a couple of weeks ago. He is so young. I think he's going to be 19 all of next year too, if I'm not mistaken. He might be 20. He'll be under 21 for sure, one of those ages. He's going to be so young next year, and we know the Orioles drafted all those college outfielders. That's going to allow a guy like Deson to really stay in Delmarva probably for much of the year and let him just slowly work about his development. But I'm going to go with another outfielder, and I stuck with AAA since they wrapped up on Sunday, and we finished up the AAA season today. I'm just going to throw out the name Zach Jarrett. I want to mention his name one more time in case I never get an opportunity to. Shout out to Zach Jarrett. Shout out to the AAA announcers for not feeding the urge to mention every single time he steps into a batter's box that he is Dale Jarrett's son, because as he's come up through the system, that is what every announcer is hung on to. But shout out to Jarrett. He played in 91 games for the Tides. The OPS was only 690. But he did reach 10 home runs this year with Norfolk, played a very good center field, and that's why I wanted to shout him out. Center field at Harbor Park is not easy to play. It's a massive park, but Jarrett was able to do it, excel defensively out there, and there's a chance that he probably never gets an opportunity at the MLB level, but he's a good example, I think, of just how difficult this sport is and a reminder of just how good major leaguers are. And so I'm sure Jarrett wasn't thrilled with his batting average or his on base percentage, but I think he can hang his hat on a successful 2021 season at AAA level. So I appreciated watching him play this year.
Yeah, it was really, I think, good for him to go up to Norfolk and serve a pretty valuable role with the depth, especially because you had a guy like Ryan McKenna up and down so much. Diaz, we know, was often on the IL so much this year. So their outfield wasn't quite what we thought it would be at the beginning of the year. So having Jarrett step up was key for them. My shout out this week goes all the way down to the Dominican Summer League, and it's Frederick Ben Cosme. First off, if you want to see a really sweet left-handed swing, go look for his on social media. And I have to shout out him like guys in Samuel Basayo who share clips on Instagram of themselves, because otherwise we would have no clue what was going on in Dominican Summer League other than stats. So shout out to them for posting video, but good left-handed stroke. 142 at-bats, put up an 816 OPS at age 18 in the Dominican Summer League this year while batting .310, 10 steals, 2 homers. I don't know what the future holds for the infielder. He was a guy the Orioles signed in August of 2020, but a guy that certainly stepped up with good numbers this year, and then I'm looking forward to seeing the Florida Complex League next year. And here's Bob weighing in, Junior Lara, with the shout-out this week. So, Bob, from the sidelines, giving us a shout-out here. So, Chris, thank you for coming in and pen sitting for us this week, doing a great job as guest host, and we look forward to having you on as a guest sometime in the future. But in the meantime, our listeners know a lot about Baltimore Sports and Life, but if you want to give a little bit of background on the site and what's up there now and why they should check it out, that would be great.
Yeah, again, thanks to you guys having me on and the coverage you provided this year. In another lost year at the major league level, you made the minor leagues more fun for everybody. It's great to see that you really captured the attention of a lot of fans. That was great. Really, kudos to you for the work you guys put in. Baltimore Sports and Life. It's been a development over time. You can come check out the site. We cover Orioles, Ravens, Terps. We've got about 30 writers. Half of them were like me. They were working in an office. It was a cathartic diversion. The other half are working for national outlets, and they're contributing to us in multiple sports. But Orioles, Ravens, Terps, but also MLB, NFL, college football, soccer, college basketball, NBA, even high school sports at this point. We got a little bit of everything, and our board is active. So if you enjoy talking about the Orioles in the minor leagues, come and join the discussions at the board. But thanks again to you guys. Very fun. Bob, hope you're feeling better, and we'll see you on the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a programming note, we will be on Tuesday next week, a special time, so you don't have to worry about trying to squeeze us into your pregame plans for Monday Night Football between the Ravens and the team that used to be in Baltimore. In the meantime, continue to follow us on Twitter at BSL on the Verge. Check out Baltimore Sports and Life for all the latest Orioles, Ravens, Terps coverage, high school sports, as Chris mentioned, and more. I actually just have a piece that went up Monday night looking at Gunnar Henderson's 2021 season, so be sure to check that out. For Nick Stevens and for Chris Stoner and Bob Phelan, this is Zach Spedden. You've been listening to On the Verge.